the current group of academics in social science and developmental psychopathology. So they're very left-wing activist types for the most part. Not every single one, but increasingly, if you have a heterodox position or you are more classically grounded, you are shunned and basically seen in various ways that aren't very appealing in academia.
Welcome back to Psychobabble, where we expose bad therapy and the liberal narratives that contribute to our poor mental health. I'm Hannah Spear. I hope you enjoyed your summer and that you had a good start to your fall. I know I enjoyed vacationing in Norway with my kids a lot, but it was exhausting, and I'm looking forward to a bit of normalcy again. And I have been very excited about this conversation today with J.D.Haltigan. We finally managed to schedule it. If you haven't heard of him, he's a PhD in developmental psychology. He's been a researcher also in evolutionary psychopathology. He's someone whose work I followed with deep appreciation, not just because of his research, but because of his courage through his Substack, the multi-level mailer, where he speaks out and names what many of us have observed, that psychology is no longer a neutral science, but that it has become often quite explicitly a tool for ideological activism.
There it is. What does social justice and psychology entail? I have 30 seconds. It means doing work that I think will positively impact people's lives. And by work, I mean research that looks at equity issues. I specifically focus on issues related to some gaming, first-generation students, undocumented students, and some work with AI, right? So looking at that kind of work and doing research on those topics and bringing that into my teaching.
How Psychology is Rooted in White Supremacy, Part 2. Western psychology leaves very little room for indigenous and ancestral healing practices, except when science has deemed them to be acceptable and valid.
Hi, JD. Welcome to Psychobabble. Thank you so much.
My pleasure, Hannah. Great to be with you, and I'm really glad we finally were able to connect and find time for this.
Absolutely. So I've spoken a lot about the psychology becoming this engine for ideology, for woke ideology. I've spoken about how it's no longer about helping people adapt to reality, but about conforming the self to fit a more progressive ideology. And so I was wondering if you first could tell us about your background and your take on that.
Yeah, sure. So real quickly, I started off, I was an athlete in college. I went to college to essentially play hockey and also study criminal justice. Ended up doubling majoring in psychology, and then the rest is really history. I did a terminal master's in forensic psychology, spent a little time working with kids in a residential facility, and I was always, after that point, was very interested in attachment theory, and ended up doing my PhD in developmental psychology at the University of Miami in Florida, and then did a series of postdocs, ended up in Toronto at the Department of Psychiatry at the University of Toronto, sort of as my last formal, quote unquote, academic appointment. And my work over the course of time, I went from studying really attachment and psychopathology, mental disorders and so forth. It became much more evolutionarily grounded from an attachment. It went from an attachment perspective to more of an evolutionary based perspective that was mutually informative. So sort of I went from more like nurture to nature in terms of understanding outcomes, behavioral and cognitive outcomes. Long story short, and then in 2020, right around 2020 here, but before that in the States, which is where I'm from, but also in Canada, things began to get very woke in mental health research and research that I was doing around basically trying to understand better mental health disorders, what their symptoms look like, and how those symptoms basically track with one another. So I did a lot of methodological statistical work trying to better understand how symptoms for various disorders are reflected in these what are called latent factor constructs. Anyways, without getting into all that, things started to go off the rails. And what I noticed is that because in mental health and developmental psychopathology work, because mental disorders are not really categorical like medical diagnoses are, the researchers in academia were becoming increasingly woke in the sense that they were taking this sort of continuous perspective of symptoms, like symptoms for any disorder. And they were using the fact that because disorders, mental health disorders, are not truly statistically categorical, that is, you don't have something that is depression inside of you in the sense like you have a cancer cell inside of you. They were trying to basically take that fact and do away with the notion of disorder, mental health disorder, and using the fact that all of mental health symptoms, depression, anxiety, whatever you want to call it, because they're continuous and they're sort of like on a spectrum, they were increasingly making the argument that categories, mental health categories, should be done away with. And that infused with a lot of the woke stuff saying, look, there's no real true normal person. So therefore, anything that is sort of statistically abnormal can just be treated as basically a variant of normality. And that's where things got really woke. I'm even writing a piece now for a journal that, under trying to sort of chart this out. But basically what happened is in mental health research, and you know this probably fairly well, is that nothing is a disorder anymore. It's basically just a personality that you can live, and you shouldn't feel any sort of personal responsibility for anything that you have. And so that's where I ended up, and I've been speaking out about that, various issues, the gender identity, insanity. I have a particular focus on personality disorders, so borderline personality disorder, um, and just really calling out the fact that wokeness in mental health research is all about doing away with any concepts where we can categorize people and say, you are mentally suffering from a mental disorder.
Mm-hmm. So you spent your whole life in academia
Until
and
about 2020.
yeah. So a couple of things. I'm going to get back to the disorder part a bit later. But first of all, when you say they, who do you mean?
The current group of academics in um, social science and developmental psychopathology. So they're very
Yeah.
left wing activist types for the most part. Not every single one, but increasingly, if you have a heterodox position or you are more classically grounded in terms of how you see the world, the need
Yeah.
for categorical diagnoses, you are shunned and basically seen in various ways that aren't very appealing in academia. So you don't want to stay in with they anymore.
Right. Yeah. Did you experience that yourself?
Sure. So when I was finishing up, I was appointed in the Department of Psychiatry at the University of Toronto, and I was speaking out against various social justice activism. I was speaking out against the fact that gender identity is basically, gender identity issues are mental health issues. The sex binary, I was, look, there's men and women. And when you speak out against that on social media, um, or you speak out and say that there are disparities across different races in various behavioral and cognitive outcomes, you are branded a bigot, a racist, whatever, what have you. And so it became untenable. Even just the simple perspective of, acknowledging the fact that, there was never a noble savage in our evolutionary history, in the sense that, human beings have been characterized by aggression and, inter-tribal warfare since, we came into existence. But because there has been such a social justice woke push to, call out what they consider to be oppression of minorities, if you counter that or you argue otherwise, you're branded in a way that doesn't make you want to stay in that kind of a setting anymore. And you can't get grant funding, you can't get research funding. It's totally ideologically captured in especially in social science research here in the West.
Yeah. And when did you notice that happening yourself? And when did you, what? So and I want to know what you think the turning point was, and also when you think the ideological capture itself happened.
For me, honestly, I happened to be my first postdoc in Canada. So I did a few different postdocs. I was applying for tenure track positions here in the United States. And I ended up doing a postdoc to stay in academia at the University of Ottawa. This is around 2013, 2016. And I was basically studying developmental psychopathology then as well. So I was studying things like bullying and victimization and how those two go together and what types of cognitive and behavioral outcomes go into somebody who bullies and what happens to somebody who's a victim of being bullied. And what was interesting to me, that's all kind of periphery, but I was in Canada at the time in Ottawa. And I remember, because I'm from the US, I was watching, US news. And just as Trump was sort of making his first run to what ended up being his first term here in the States, the news was sort of going off the rails. It was just becoming completely, completely deranged in a way that I had never experienced before. And then I was starting to connect that with what I was seeing in the classroom. So I did a little bit of teaching at the University of Ottawa. And of course, you're in a campus setting, so you're around the milieu. And that was my first hint that things were starting to go off the rails.
How
And
did
from
you notice
Ottawa,
that the first time?
say that again.
So was there a specific event or
It was just basically it
situation?
evolved over time. It wasn't a situation in academia per se. I was continually going on job interviews across the U.S. And, I'd go out on these faculty interviews, and you realize right away that regardless of how you performed during your interview, you're already out there based on your merit, your academic credentials, but you just got a vibe that it was, especially in psychology and the social science, that these folks kind of weren't on the same page as you, just interpersonally. And then I ended up going from Ottawa to Toronto, which is where I got my first appointment in a department. And it was then that, like, the gender insanity stuff right around 2017, 2018 just took off. And I started realizing that, wow, there's really people, academic researchers, who don't believe in the sex binary, or they're just doing things that are completely antithetical to what I, as a scientist, had been trained to understand is the right way of doing business.
Yeah.
And
But
I
did it go
remember,
from you sort of being agreeing with them on a range of issues and having normal relations with them, and then suddenly you were talking about the gender ideology, and you realized what is happening here,
I
or
think it
was
was
it?
more, when I got to Toronto, I knew a few of the people I was working with. And I was working with two really sets of different people, one in a really hardcore, sort of more neurobiological brain side. And then there was another group of researchers who come from more of a social science perspective. And of course, it was the social science perspective that went woke right away, but you're always
Yeah.
trying to sort of create teams. And I remember being on a few grants or asking people, because you always want to sort of extend yourself and see if you can include people on grants that you write, or that you try to get funded.
Yeah, yeah,
And it was right around that time when I was saying that terms like equity were bankrupt terms that didn't really mean equality of outcomes. You saw the sort of favoritism and the bias and sort of how they were treating racial categories in grant proposals. Recruitment for like DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion, which is over here sort of this sort of preference for minorities. It was getting to be completely very noticeable in grant writing. And then, of course, me being active on social media, I was getting some pushback from people within the institution that I was at, saying you can't say this kind of thing on social media. And
yeah. That was
I was
about
like,
gender then, what you were
there
posting?
was a couple of tweets. One I made about the Noble Savage thing, so they weren't necessarily
Oh, yeah.
directly related to gender. I mean, I was
Yeah,
tweeting about that, and I started to tweet about that more. But you just knew that you were sort of on their naughty list if you said
yeah.
anything that went against the sort of current progressive norm that was sort of continuing to balloon up in academia.
Okay. So I have the impression that I've also written about this the gender ideology. Oh, let me put it differently. Um, I've noticed lately that more and more psychologists are speaking out about their opposing the views on gender ideology. On Twitter and on Substack, it's becoming more. You're joined by more professionals now than you were, say, 5 years ago, on this. What are we really doing with this gender ideology, and encouraging that in kids? And I find it interesting how there are more and more whistleblowers on this, and at the same time, not really truly investigating the roots, how that. I don't think that suddenly happens. Right? I think that this was a long time coming, and that what we're seeing in gender ideology is really just a tip of the iceberg, something that we built in psychology a long time ago. What is your take on that, and that this what we're seeing now, what more people are reacting to? Hold on, this isn't right. Um, Actually, is something that was doomed to happen.
I think, and I've said this before on other shows that I've been on. I think that especially in the social sciences, they're disproportionately loaded with female scholars, and I think that creates a disproportion that leads to some of what we've been seeing. So you mentioned the gender stuff. Yes, it was happening well before those seeds were planted, and those seeds were planted in things like women's studies and gender studies.
Mm.
And you can go back in time and see when the whole concept of gender became basically disconnected from what it used to mean, which is basically biological sex. And it
Yeah,
became then associated with sort of the social conventional rules that you played, and it became really tied in with feminism. And that was basically a big part of where gender ideology came out of. And the idea, and I think this is more of a theoretical point, women tend to see the world, especially at a more individual level, focus, which makes sense evolutionary. They focus on individuals. They don't focus on systems and large patterns like men do. And so what you end up with is what I say has happened within the field of psychology altogether. You end up with an incessant focus on what's called the ideographic perspective rather than a nomothetic perspective. And for your listeners, basically what an ideographic perspective means is just seeing personality and behavior as unique to each individual, like a clinician treats an individual, versus nomothetic, meaning you name patterns and you create groups and you understand patterns at a higher level than just an individual. But the way societies have to function is at the nomothetic level. You have to have groups and categories and diagnoses to enable civic functioning. You can't see everybody as having their own separate truth about who they are and about their own little particular disorder, or otherwise you end up with just total chaos. There's no truth at all. And that's what's happened with gender identity. Basically the idea that
Yeah.
if you feel a certain way,
Yeah.
whatever way you feel goes. There's no stabilizing anchor.
Right.
And, this is the tip of the iceberg. I mean, you have on social media and even off of that, people who basically have what's called, or what they belong to, these groups that are called non-consensus based realities, where you can basically live in your own reality. You could be a schizophrenic and claim that that world is the normal world and you're not disordered.
Yeah.
So if you go on Instagram and you look into the plurals community, you'll find people living multiple personalities and they think that that's normal.
Yeah. But do you think this is limited to gender studies, women's studies, or do you see this spread across the entire field of psychology? When you talked about subjectivism and lived experience and this whole so social constructivism.
Yeah, no, it started in gender studies and women's studies, but
Mm.
it's spread entirely. I mean, you have once reputable journals who regularly engage and publish stuff that is completely social constructivist and social decontextualization of personality disorders, for example. So, borderline personality disorder is just more or less sort of a normative thing. And it's due to the fact that normative society has stigmatized these people and so
Right.
forth and so forth. So, yeah, it's spread entirely across all the social sciences, including even some of the evolutionary sciences as well. But there is a bulwark. The further you go, that's more evolutionarily grounded or purely mathematical, it becomes harder. There's a little bulwark there against that social constructivist postmodern sensibility. But even that is being infiltrated by some of this ideology.
Hmm. Yeah, because no one's asking really, as far as I can see, how we ended up with things like lived experience and this level of subjectivism, and when you look at some of the research, how it's just completely qualitative, just
Mm-hmm.
based on interviews, we know this and this, and then it's propagated as sort of as this as truth, and how was this allowed as a this yeah, maybe we can speak a little bit about qualitative research, as opposed to the things that you have been doing, how
Well,
we
yeah,
got there.
I think you bring up a great point with the qualitative aspect. That was sort of an inroad to some of how we got there. I remember, when you mentioned qualitative, it brought up a memory I had, and I'm vaguely recounting this memory, but I remember on a job interview, I believe it was one of the Midwestern schools I went to, and you're in these faculty interviews, and I think one of the scholars there, one of the faculty asked me, would I be willing to lend a hand with qualitative research, or just what my feelings were about qualitative research? And I said,
Oh, really?
certainly. Yeah, I said, certainly I'd be more than helpful to, provide advice, or, even in qualitative research, you do like subjective coding, and then you end up at some point with some statistical analysis. But I remember saying at the same time, it's a different kind of work that is less objective and less rigorous as quantitative work, empirical work. And I
Hmm.
think that comment, and maybe I was demonstrating a certain level of body language that expressed that I felt that qualitative research was inferior to hard empirical rigor. I never heard back from that school again. You know what I mean?
Oh,
So that's a gateway into that whole idea that your feelings matter more than what the truth is. And so, the qualitative aspect was an entry road into exactly what we're living through now, which is just sort of, qualitative research became sort of synthesized with this political postmodernism and Marxism, where there's just everybody's the same and there's no inherent disparities in behavioral and cognitive outcomes. And you can see how, at least I can, looking back, how the whole field of psychology, psychology came from philosophy. So there's sort of a leftist vulnerability there that was exploited by radical progressivism. And that's how we ended up here.
Right. How far back do you think it goes?
Well, I mean, as far as my historical tracings, I would go back to, I just off the top of my head, I'm only, I wasn't born until the late 70s. So I would trace it back to the 60s and civil rights, a lot of that stuff, at least here in the States. But, even some of the origins of the field can be tied indirectly to leftist sentiment. The psychology is a softer science. It's focused on emotions and feelings. So that attracts a particular type of researcher. Psychiatrists and clinical psychologists are focused on helping people. And that's going to attract a certain type of personality that values feelings over perhaps, the truth. And so that's how you end up there. And over time, the field just sort of winnows out those who are not that way. And so you end up with disproportionately a field that is, I don't say this in a sort of misogynistic way, but it's entirely feminized. And I include in that feminized men. You just don't
Absolutely.
have, you don't have masculine men or masculine women in these professions anymore. It's just entirely woke feminized lunacy. And what you end up with is just feelings over truth, subjectivity over objectivity. And what that means then is that the entire field becomes disconnected from what it should be, which is informing society, how we treat, groups of people.
That concludes the free episode of Psychobabble. I hope you enjoyed it. I also hope you join us over in the members exclusive segment, the Psychobabble Insider. So upgrade, and here's a preview of that. I was thinking about more that our environment. We have created such an environment that we are encouraging the expression and the wildness of the neuroticism that people are born predisposition to have.
Yeah, it's like the quotation. A lot of the woke feminists think that the id cannot live free in a normal world. Well, we can stop focusing on emotions.
Can you say mental health?
All this mental health talk in preschool and kindergarten, and the fear mongering about climate.
I'm doing this for my son. The government's inaction on climate change is a death sentence for us all.
That's all creating the elements to not really control your emotion.
If you're not joining us there, then enjoy your Wednesday, and I'll see you next time.